All right, welcome back. So what we're going to talk about in this part of our central nervous system lecture is cell physiology, focusing primarily on the structure of different types of neurons, and we'll talk about three general types, and then kind of focus in on two in particular. And then we'll also talk about how different um, neurons can form what are called circuits and how they can join together and form kind of these interconnections. So if we look at different types of neurons, we'll see that we have three general types. We'll talk about two here, but there's multipolar neurons, there are bipolar neurons, and there are unipolar neurons. All right. Now these are categorized based on the number of poles. So this is why they're called multipolar, bipolar, unipolar. Which of these processes that are coming off of the soma or coming off of the cell body, right? So if we look here, if we have a cell body, right? So here's our cell body, and if we have one extension coming off this way, and we have multiple coming into the cell, we're going to call this a multipolar neuron. So that's what we see right here. Now this is the most common type of neuron that we find in our body, and typically whenever we talk about neurons just in general with respect to the nervous system and action potentials, generally we're talking about multipolar neurons. Okay, so they have multiple poles coming off, and the examples of these are all of our motor neurons. So the motor neurons and a lot of our interneurons that are specifically for our motor neurons that are going out to our effectors, so going out to our skeletal muscle, are of this multipolar variety, right? So you can see here, we've got a pole here, we've got a pole here, we've got another one right here, and then we've got this long axon right here, right? So those are all of the different poles. Now for bipolar, the term bi, right? The bi just means two. So here we have a cell body, and we have one extension in one direction, and we have another extension in the opposite direction, right? So when we look here, we have one dendrite here, and we have one process, one axon right here. Okay, so this is a bipolar neuron. Now, a lot of these neurons are for our senses, right? Our special senses. So things for our eyesight, for our sense of vision, for our sense of smell, our sense of taste. A lot of these are bipolar neurons. So one of the layers of our retina contains cells that are called bipolar cells or bipolar neurons. All right. So the last type that's not really seen here, but we'll look at it whenever we look at the spinal cord here in a little while, is called unipolar neurons. And so unipolar, you may guess, have only one pole. And so what you'd see is you'd see a cell body, right? Coming off of that cell body, you'd have this little projection, and then extending off in either direction, you would have these projections. So you'd have one going that way, and you'd have one going this way as well. And so what you have is you end up just having one pole. This one long structure here, this is the one pole of the neuron. So this is a type of unipolar neuron. Now, in our bodies and in humans, our sensory neurons for our kind of general senses coming into our spinal cord, bringing sensory information back to the central nervous system. These are of the unipolar variety. Okay. So let's see here. Let's erase all this. All right. So whenever we look at other types of cells, we know that we have neurons that we just mentioned, but we also have cells called neuroglial cells, or glial for short. Now, glial cells make up the majority of the cells by percentage, right? So the sheer number of cells, there are more glial cells than there are neurons. When you look up, when you look at the cells that take up the most in the nervous system by volume, it's actually the neurons that make up the most by volume. And so what this means is that our neurons have to be physically larger than our glial cells, and that's exactly what we see. Most of our glial cells are relatively small relative to our neurons. So one type of glial cell is an oligodendrocyte, right? So an oligodendrocyte is a myelinating cell, so they create myelin, specifically within the central nervous system. So when we look here, we can see these myelinating cells, these oligodendrocytes, and they have these processes that extend out and form the myelin sheath on our axons of neurons within the central nervous system. Okay, so oligodendrocytes can myelinate multiple axons at a time and multiple regions on a single axon at one time. There are other cells called Schwann cells that do the same thing basically. They myelinate, but they myelinate specifically in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so oligodendrocytes are specifically within our central. When we look at another cell, we have ones called astrocytes. We've talked about astrocytes a few times with respect to the blood-brain barrier, and they have those perivascular feet that extend around the blood vessel, seal the blood vessel, and prevent any and every molecule from just indiscriminately diffusing out and going into the brain tissue. Okay. Now they have other functions as well. Release of ATP for repair. They contribute to the actual structure, the three-dimensional structure of our brain. They function in neurotransmitter secretion and absorption, and they are the most abundant. So out of all of our glial cells, our astrocytes are going to be the most abundant. All right, next type we have here is the ependymal cell. We've also mentioned these with respect to whenever we are creating our cerebrospinal fluid, right? So they extended around that choroid plexus. As blood from the capillary was filtered out, it goes through the ependymal cell. It is filtered, things are added, things are removed, and we get our final CSF. So when we look at this picture here, here's our blood vessel here in the middle. Here's the pia mater on the outside, and then we have these ependymal cells. Blood is going to exit. It will be filtered, and as it is filtered, things are added, things are removed, and what we're left with is our final cerebrospinal fluid that enters into the lumen or enters into the cavity of our ventricles. Okay. We also have ones called microglia. So whenever we talked about the skin, we talked about the integumentary system, there is a specific cell type called the dendritic cell. The dendritic cell is what is known as a macrophage or a phagocytic cell of the skin, so of the integumentary system. It's an immune system cell, and it serves to phagocytize or to eat or to cellularly engulf old cells, foreign cells, dead cells, worn out cell parts, and whatnot. And so in our central nervous system, we have cells that do very similar things, and these are called microglia or microglial cells, right? And these are part of the immune system. They're a phagocyte, so they engulf and they eat. You can kind of think of cell eating foreign cells, dead cells, old cell parts, and debris. Okay. We also have these or similar types of cells in the lungs, and they're called dust cells or alveolar macrophages. And we also have them in the liver, and they're called Kupffer cells. But the ones in the lungs and the liver and the central nervous system and the skin, they're all performing basically the same function in their respective organs and their respective locations. Okay. So what we can have now is we can look at the neurons specifically. So we talked about neurons and neuroglia. If we go back to the neurons specifically, our neurons can be arranged into different types of circuits. And the circuits have to do with the orientation of the neurons with respect to their synapses. So how are they synapsing with other neurons, and how are they sending their signals, or how are they sending their action potentials, all right? So one example is called a converging circuit. So if you converge on anything, or the term converge just in everyday use, is when you start kind of broad and general and you narrow down and you pinpoint on one single thing. So for this, we're starting very broad, right? We're starting with all of these presynaptic neurons. And if you remember, here are all of our synapses, right? So synapses are where those two neurons meet. We have presynaptic here, and we have a postsynaptic here, all right? So in a converging circuit, you have multiple presynaptic neurons, and they all converge, or they all come in on a single postsynaptic cell, which we see here. And the end result, or the output, is some common function, right? So in this example here, we have multiple stimuli. So we have sight, we have sounds, we have smells. You may hear somebody talking about cooking, and the output is we get salivation, right? So we get one common result, one common output from all of these stimuli. So we have all of this stimulus coming, all these stimuli coming in, and the end result is one final output, okay? So the next one is a diverging circuit. So a diverging circuit is essentially the exact opposite of a converging circuit. So instead of coming down onto one output, we start very specifically, we start with one input, and then we end up with all of these outputs. Okay, so we have one presynaptic neuron, and we end up with multiple postsynaptic neurons. Now remember, when you're naming neurons as being presynaptic, postsynaptic, you have to be specific to which synapse you're talking about. So relative to this synapse, this is the presynaptic neuron, and these are the postsynaptic neurons, right? But relative to these synapses here, this is the presynaptic neuron, and these are the postsynaptic neurons, right? So you have to be specific in particular about which synapse you're talking about. But an example of this circuit is whenever we have motor activity being sent out to our muscles, right? So we may have one initial thought of moving or contracting a muscle, so that's where we're starting here, the input. And what we get is you can replace all of these neurons essentially with muscle fibers, and you get contraction of all of these muscle fibers for some common output, right? So we have a signal, starts in the brain, that goes to muscles for walking, and then we get different muscles that are being contracted for balance, for walking, for posture, for all of these different things. Okay, so this is a diverging circuit. The next one is called a reverberating circuit. All right, so a reverberating circuit has to do with a single presynaptic neuron sending a signal, and then this signal in turn stimulates the next cell, which then kind of goes back to the previous cell to re-stimulate it, and so you get this continuous cycle. And so this is an example of positive feedback, right? So this is a rare example of positive feedback in the body in which one stimulus reinforces, the outcome of a stimulus reinforces that same stimulus. So we've talked about in previous lectures the idea of like blood clotting as being a positive feedback, childbirthing being a positive feedback. So this here, this reverberating circuit, this is another example of a positive feedback loop. So example here is how we breathe, essentially, or keeping us breathing while we're asleep. So you may have a signal come down what's called the phrenic nerve, and we'll talk about the phrenic nerve later. The phrenic nerve stimulates the diaphragm, and then you continually have this, this continuous cycle, this reverberation back that keeps the stimulation going, that keeps the diaphragm contracting, that ultimately keeps us breathing. Okay, so this is an example of a reverberating circuit. And then lastly, we have one called a parallel after discharge circuit. And so this is one that is largely implicated in higher order thinking, higher order functioning. And so you have one single kind of presynaptic, or maybe a few presynaptic, and the general flow of the signal is in one single direction, right? So all of these signals were all going toward one common output. So in this, for higher order thinking, we may use different types of stimuli, or we may retrieve memory, we may rely on previous information, and what we get is a common output. So something like for mathematical calculation, that's considered to be a higher order thinking type of activity. Okay. So we will stop there, and we'll pick up with the next part talking about some gross anatomy of our spinal cord.